Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation's LNTV. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and today we're joined by Liberty Nation's Legal Affairs Editor, Mr. Scott DeCosenza. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Mark.
So, Scott, big ruling from the Supreme Court today on robocalls. Scott, can you tell us a bit about the case?
Well, the case name is Barr v. American Association of Political Consultants, Mark, and political consultants want to be able to make robocalls to people with cell phones, and they are denied the right to do so because the law in the United States before this decision was that only the federal government could make robocalls or people collecting debts on its behalf.
So as of today, Scott, what's the ruling?
So the initial federal law that was passed prohibited all robocalls to cell phones. Congress then passed an amendment to that law which allowed for an exception for debt collection for the federal government. These political consultants have sued and said, well, if the federal government is allowed to call to collect their debt, why aren't I allowed to call to engage in political speech? That's an impermissible imposition on the First Amendment. And the Supreme Court ruling today is that, yes, that is impermissible, and that the remedy is that the exception that allows the debt collectors to call is eliminated.
Okay, so what was the liberal position on this one?
When rights are negatively affected by legislation and challenged in court, the Supreme Court applies a number of tests to determine whether a law will be found to be constitutional. The hardest test to overcome is what's called the strict scrutiny test, and that's what the Supreme Court says when a fundamental right is implicated, the law has to be narrowly tailored to advance a compelling government interest. And basically, most of the conservatives applied that strict scrutiny test to this law and found that it failed that test. Justice Breyer wrote an opinion joined by Justice Kagan and I believe perhaps Ginsburg. And what Justice Breyer articulates is that he thinks because it's about commercial speech, he says this case has to do with granting, in this case, the government debt collectors extra rights that others don't have. And because it's a commercial speech, he doesn't give it the fundamental right protection of a strict scrutiny analysis. Justice Gorsuch, who wrote, and he was joined by Justice Thomas, in his opinion, says that Justice Breyer has it wrong, that this is not about commercial speech. And the reason why is the political speech was banned, which is to say the government allowed much of this other speech to take place, this debt collection speech, and forbade the political speech. The conservatives agreed that it was not legal, this restriction, but they disagreed on what to do about it. Justice Gorsuch and Justice Thomas say that that law itself likely violates the Constitution. In other words, the law that bans robocalls for instance, political purposes is likely an imposition against the First Amendment.
And so what was the liberal position here, Scott?
And the liberals, Mark, disagreed in a different area. They disagreed whether or not strict scrutiny applied. So Justice Sotomayor, for instance, thought that intermediate scrutiny applied, a lesser level of review, but also that the imposition failed that test. She didn't think that this special right for debt collectors to call was warranted within the First Amendment. So she would say that it also failed, but for a different reason.
That's an interesting mix of unlikely allies.
A bit
now,
of a
Scott,
dog's lunch, I think, Mark,
isn't it?
Of decisions to read.
Here's the thing, Scott. It seems that from the Joe Public's point of view, it means that people aren't going to be calling them on their cell phones anytime soon. So that's probably good, right?
The Constitution itself makes no delineation between commercial speech or non-commercial speech. It simply holds a very high standard that says that Congress shall not forbid or limit the freedom of speech, and it seems like they did in this case.
Scott, thank you very much for outlining this particularly tricky case. Much appreciated.
Cheers, Mark.
And thanks to you at home for watching.
Go deeper on the topic discussed in this video, head on over to one of these links here or go to our Liberty Nation Roku channel. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for Liberty.